We're so glad you can join us today. So as you can see here on today's webinar, I'm sure you expected this as you signed up, eyes wide open, writing about AI before writing with AI. I'm so pleased to be able to announce our guest of honor today, Miriam Moore. So Dr. Miriam Moore is an assistant professor of English at the University of North Georgia. She teaches undergraduate linguistics and grammar courses, developmental English courses, integrated reading and writing, ESL composition and pedagogy, and the first year composition sequence. She is a co-author with Susan Anker of Real Essays, Real Writing, and Real Reading and Writing. She has over 20 years experience in community college teaching as well. Her interests include applied linguistics, writing about writing, approaches to composition, professionalism for two-year college English faculty, and threshold concepts for composition, reading, and grammar. So with that, I am going to stop my sharing so I could turn it over to our esteemed guest, Dr. Miriam Moore. Welcome, Miriam, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Vivian. I am so thrilled to be with everybody today, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so again, thank you so much for having me today. I'm excited about sharing with you all some of the journey that I have been on in relationship to teaching and thinking about AI, particularly in the writing classroom, but I'm also going to talk about it in linguistics classrooms and ESOL pedagogy classrooms, and even in the grammar classrooms where I teach. To start this, it has been a journey. And what I'd like to point out is that I really began this back in November, December 2022. It's when I first heard of ChatGPT, of generative AI, and I wasn't really sure what I was hearing about. But I thought as I went into the spring of 2023 and began to hear a bit more about it, that I was going to run out in front of this. I was going to be on top of it. And I was going to get this in my classrooms in a meaningful way right off the bat. So I did a short unit in my co-requisite class in the spring of 2023. I also introduced this to the writing fellows with whom I am working most semesters. I supervise a group of junior and senior level writing fellows who cooperate with our co-requisite classes as well as classes across the discipline. So I introduced the concept of generative AI. We played around with it in class, and I thought, yeah, I've done some work, but as I can show you on this image here, I really didn't know what I was doing. My eyes were not wide open, and that became clear pretty quickly. First of all, within a few weeks after introducing the concept of ChatGPT and playing around with it in my co-requisite class, one of my multilingual co-requisite writers received a charge of plagiarism in another class based on her use of ChatGPT to finish an assignment. I was not anticipating that, and it was frightening. At the same time, I learned from my husband, who is a minister, that this was not just happening in the public schools or in the universities. He had colleagues who were turning to ChatGPT for things like sermon outlines. Some of my better students began to tell me that they were using ChatGPT to bypass some long readings. And this was within months of just even first hearing about ChatGPT. I had students who were using it as a surrogate search engine. I had faculty members and colleagues who were talking about suddenly writing in huge and terrifying prohibitions, and others who were embracing it totally. We were not getting much guidelines from our institution. I had colleagues even telling me they were doing lesson planning and generating teaching materials. I had some grad students. My oldest daughter is a graduate student finishing up her PhD, and she was telling me about, there are people who are using it for their cover letters, for their job apps, basic emails. She was also seeing in her work AI-generated outlines and AI-generated and edited thesis statements. We were seeing it, she was seeing it in particular, and spending a lot of time trying to document that there was the use of this in take-home tests and heavily weighted discussion board posts in the classrooms where she was teaching. So I thought, wow, this has really hit me by storm. I was not ready for what was going on in the higher education setting when it came to generative AI. But it wasn't just in the classroom. At the same time, there were headlines that I was beginning to see all in the spring and summer of last year related to generative AI in a more public sphere. And you may have seen some of these. Not only the professor who was had asked ChatGPT if ChatGPT wrote certain papers, and it said that it had, and he was flunking students right and left. And it turns out ChatGPT could not recognize itself, and it had not written those papers. AI generated articles, the Sports Illustrated, where they had not only AI generated content, but there was AI generated photos of writers who didn't exist that were associated with this AI generated content. Anyway, all of this was overwhelming to me. That the New York Times was suing OpenAI because OpenAI was using New York Times content that to train the AI, which would then generate content that would compete with the New York Times. And then even at my own institution, this past fall, we had a student who was put on academic probation after being accused of using AI to write a paper, which she says and has some evidence to prove that it was only it went through Grammarly's editing software, but not necessarily a full AI. And there were lines and questions about what we needed to do. At the same time, I was getting a number of emails and invitations, and I was seeing articles that I needed to take classes so that I would learn how to use AI because it was going to transform higher education. So all of this over the span of about 6 months left me feeling overwhelmed, shocked. After 25 years of teaching, I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. I decided I wanted to take a pause. I needed to take a step back. I needed to breathe. I needed to think. I also needed to learn. I had a lot of learning that I needed to do about generative AI. It was not going to be something that I could just whoosh put into my classes. I needed to open my eyes and see what was going on. And mostly, I wanted to learn enough about AI to think about it strategically in my classrooms, so that it meshed and aligned with the way that I approach teaching. I did not want to do something and realize later, as I did with this young student who was a multilingual student in my class, later accused of plagiarism. I don't want to set my students up for situations that they cannot control because they've learned to use AI in ways that are not helpful. I wanted them to have some agency and control in the matter. I found this quote from Dune that I really, really liked, which is the idea that I don't want my students or myself to be enslaved to an algorithm or to a machine. So I needed some time to think. And I began that process about a year ago at the end of the spring and the summer, and it's worked through the fall. And what I've landed on is the idea that I want to teach critical AI literacy in my classes, whether it's first year writing or advanced linguistics or ESOL pedagogy. I want to be teaching critical AI literacy. I want to teach students to write about AI before they write with AI so that they can make choices with some agency. I'm not abandoning anything that I'm already doing. So I teach in a conceptual framework that is built on threshold concepts and writing about writing. I'm still going to do that in my first year writing classes. I have used information from the framework for information literacy. I'm still going to do that. And all of the links here, by the way, when we share the presentation, will be available to you. You'll be able to join and see these links. But what I want to do is to infuse in the frameworks of the classrooms and the pedagogy that I'm already using. I want to infuse critical artificial intelligence AI literacy. And my basic sources for this are the Rutgers Critical AI Literacy website. It is a treasure trove of excellent information. And I've got a link there, which again, we will share after the presentation is over. I'm also drawing heavily from the work of Dr. Emily Bender. She is a linguist, a computational linguist out at the University of Washington. She is not someone who is opposed to technology in any sense of the word, but she is someone who has her eyes as open as anyone when it comes to what AI can and cannot do. And in fact, she does not say AI unless it's got air quotes around it. And there are reasons for that I'll talk about in a minute. She has a number of video resources, not aimed at students. These are going to be aimed at faculty. Some articles. Her most famous is called the Stochastic Parrots article, if you're interested in it. But she also has a podcast that she does, a mystery AI hype theater podcast. She does that every 2 or 3 weeks, and I will mention that a little bit later on. But those are the sources that I am drawing on for information for my critical AI literacy. This is a framework. I'm working on it. I don't have my syllabus all perfectly designed. I will be doing that over the summer, creating that syllabus. I have my email address on this presentation. I would be more than happy to share that syllabus for the freshman writing class when it's done. It's just not there yet. Right now, it is a framework. So what is the framework? Let me walk through that. What I want to do is to introduce critical AI literacy in my classes through 4 question clusters. I'd started with 8, that seemed to be kind of huge, so I've narrowed it down to 4. And in today's presentation, I'm just going to walk through these 4 clusters of questions that I want to introduce to my students, and I'll talk to you just a moment about some of the activities that I am thinking about and ways of bringing these questions to the fore with my students. So what are the questions? First of all, what is AI? I want them to have an understanding of what the technology actually is and what it does. Then I want to talk about who makes the rules for AI at a policy level, to think about rules, policies, and regulations governing AI and why we need them potentially, and who makes those. The third question is how to make personal decisions about how you're going to use AI. What guidelines will govern our choices? And then finally, how does the language that we use to talk about AI actually influence the ways we think about it and the ways that we use it? So these are the 4 question clusters. And like I said, in my presentation today, I am going to walk through what I think is important about each question and some ideas about how I might introduce this in my classroom setting. So the first question, what is AI? Artificial intelligence, what is generative AI, and is it actually intelligent? These are also known as large language models, and I would like to ask my students to think about how they are trained and developed, how companies build them and the biases that are inherent in them, and then the environmental costs associated with the AI industry. Ultimately, what I'm asking for here is that students get beyond the user interface, to have an understanding, not a detailed technical understanding, but a basic understanding of what's going on behind the user interface. My example here is a clock. This is a lovely grandfather clock. And for me, the user interface is what we're looking at right there. And as long as it tells me the time, I'm usually pretty happy with that. But my son, who is 19, has apprenticed to a clock repairman and a watch repairman. When he looks at a grandfather clock, he is not looking at that user interface. He sees the inner workings, and he knows what goes on, what has to happen for that clock to be able to tell me the time. The top and bottom pictures here are actually 2 grandfather clock mechanisms that he has taken apart, cleaned, repaired, and put back together recently. He has a very different view of the clock than the user interface. And that's what I'm looking for when I'm working with my students in AI. It's what I've been learning about. And I think it makes a difference when we know what's behind the user interface. This quote, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to focus on a part of it, explains what's happening underneath that interface with what's called deep learning, machine learning. DL is deep learning, ML is machine learning, AI, artificial intelligence. It is a system that optimizes performance on data-driven tasks by updating weights in an elaborate network of calculations. And I think that is important. They need to see that it is a series of calculations that is trained to generate outputs. And it continually trains by adjusting the weights in its system of calculations so that it can better predict what the output should be. And that doesn't matter if it's predicting a chess move or hurricanes or the next words in a sentence. It is predicting what output would be. It's not finding information, it's predicting output. So when my students see the generative AI interface, which looks like this on ChatGPT, the most recent version, It looks to them as though they're going to get something akin to a text message interface. They message in, they get a response. What I want them to see is that underlying this is that big network of calculations and algorithms that have been trained to predict what words should come next. It's not a real conversation, it's a series of trained algorithms. But even those trained algorithms did not come to be just in a computer science lab. They required hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hours of human labor. Some of that labor not compensated well, some of that labor in unfortunate conditions. So this is something that I've been learning about, and I want to share with my students so that they can see this as well. So early on, data, obviously from the internet, was used to train GPT to predict language strings, so strings of sentences and what words would come next. But to train it, they didn't want GPT to produce things that were obscene or violent. So they had people scrubbing that data. That was very almost traumatic, I guess, for some of those workers, because they were looking for things that were horrific so that they could remove them from the training data. Those scrubbers had to do a lot of work. Even today, there are annotators in image-based AIs. AI is not very good at recognizing images. So we have annotators who will sit for hours and look at screens and identify, for example, shoes, to make sure that the program identifies shoes and does not identify things that are not shoes. And it is a very time-consuming and sometimes tedious work. And when it is farmed off in other countries, not very transparently, it can be work that is done for a pittance of a pay, 50 cents, $1 an hour. It is uncomfortable work, and it is labor that we often don't think about. Some of the annotation today is done here in the United States. It may pay a bit better. I actually have a student this semester who is working as an AI trainer. One of the things they do is they talk to the AI, and when they get two different sets of messages, they look and they say, yes, this one's good, this one's not as good, and they tell why. And that data is continually updating. They're also annotating, this is a joke, this is a greeting, this is irony, this is sarcasm, things like that, annotating that data so that the GPT can give more appropriate, more human sounding answers when it is predicting its next steps. So yes, there is an algorithm and there's code that looks like that, but that comes with a lot of human labor. And so these are some things I want my students to think about. When we answer these questions, what is AI? What does it do? And how does it get to us? How did we get the AI that we are using, or we think that we're using so quickly? Classroom activities, I want my students to understand that an AI is therefore functioning very, very differently from a search engine. A search engine is searching for bits of data and bringing back websites that I might be able to use to find information. An AI is predicting the next word in a string. That's a very different technology. So I want them to look at that reality. Because that is a different technology, AIs can come up with hallucinations. It's not always very good at getting accurate content because it's not built for accuracy. It is built to predict the next probable word in a string, in a phrase or a sentence. That's again a different ball game, and I want them to think about that. What is that? How is that task different? And then, of course, in the process, we will talk about all the things that we normally talk about in a freshman writing class. I would talk about speech acts, for example, but I want them to understand that what appear to be speech acts in the data or the output of an AI bot, those are not real speech acts. They are speech acts that are there because someone somewhere annotated the machine or the output and said, hey, this is an apology, and apologies should occur when problems in data have been indicated. So this was an instance here I have on the bottom of the screen where I had asked GPT for information. It gave me the wrong information. When I corrected it, it says, I apologize. But I want my students to understand that is not an intended apology. It is a predicted apology because when the machine is wrong, it has been trained to give the apology, not that it means anything. It doesn't have the intent to apologize. So it has the appearance of a speech act without actually having the speech act. We also want the students to know that the algorithm itself cannot be neutral. It can and will include biases. And I know that you all have heard about this, but I want them to see it. Just this weekend, I was playing around with Meta AI, which is in Facebook, and I asked it 3 questions. Show me a typical linguist, show me a typical English professor, show me a typical pastor. And it gave me 12 images in answer to those questions. And in all 12, every image was of a middle-aged or older white male. I did not get any variation in the images that I saw until I asked about a kindergarten teacher. Now, does that mean that there are no linguists of color? No, absolutely not. The real answer to the question, show me a typical linguist, should be there is no typical linguist. Linguists come in all shapes, sizes, colors, backgrounds. They are not all English speaking. They are not all men. They are not all white. They are a variety. Students need to see that the machine, it is created by humans, it is trained by humans, and it is trained on human language, and it will reflect the biases inherent in human language. So all of these are some things that I would like to incorporate into my classes under this cluster, this first cluster of understanding what AI is, and by default, what it is not. So is there a question at this point that I can take before we look at the second cluster of ideas or questions that I think are relevant to AI literacy?
We haven't had any questions come in yet, but definitely if someone has a question about the definition, that first part, what is AI, feel free to enter it in the queue. And we can always address it at the end of the presentation, but none have come in. I think people are just like paying attention.
Okay, very good.
But if you do have questions, I forgot to mention this at the start. If you do have questions during the presentation, feel free to enter them at that point, because I know how it is. Sometimes you're like, oh, I forgot what I wanted to ask. So please enter it as you have it, and we'll address it as soon as we can.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, I'll go on to the second cluster of questions, and this is who makes the rules? Who makes the rules for AI?
And Miriam, if I may a moment, we did have one question come in.
Sure, yes.
Tell us what computational linguistics is.
What was that? Like, yeah.
Can you tell us what computational linguistics is?
Yes, without computational linguistics, we wouldn't have generative AI. Computational linguistics is the merging of syntactic theory, so the study of how languages are put together, with theories of formal logic and I guess computer code might be the best way of looking at that. So people who work in computational linguistics are interested in computer programs that generate language output, but that also create a number of ways of understanding language more effectively using metaphors around computers. One of the things that computational linguists have done is they have developed not only some of the software related to AI, but also things like spell checkers, machine translators, text completion software, speech recognition software, software that allows for various language accessibility issues. All of that is in the purview of computational linguistics. And again, a lot of them are trying to take human language and connect it with either statistical probabilities or algorithms and structures that can be simulated or placed into a computer network. It's not my basic area, but it is one that I find absolutely fascinating. Yeah.
Thank you, Miriam. We've had a couple more come in. Do you want to take one now or leave one?
We'll do one more now. Yeah, that's fine.
Now.
Let's do one more now, and then I'll look at the next cluster.
Okay, so then not a fully formed question, but was just thinking about assignments or classroom activities designed to help students see how AI is biased and hallucinates. Any experience or thoughts on that?
Um, a couple. One is just what I just did with Meta AI. If you can get it to generate an image, 9 times out of 10, you're going to discover a bias there. Interesting questions, asking it to, let's see if I can think of another example. The other place with hallucinations, one of the places it hallucinates most often is in generating textual support for something. So if you ask it to, for example, explain the foreshadowing in a certain piece of literature and give quotes from the text, 9 times out of 10, those quotes are going to be not actual real quotes. They're going to be made up. So that's a possibility to get it to hallucinate. That's where I've seen most of the hallucinations. It's when I push it to try to come up with specific quoted examples, it makes them up. So for me, that has been the easiest way to get it to show some kind of hallucination. With the bias, it's easier to do it with the images. Although I will say, I haven't done this. This is an Emily Bender example. She talked about looking at machine translations. The language Turkish only has a single pronoun for he, she, it. So he, she, and it would all be a single pronoun in the Turkish language. When you get it to give it a sentence that in Turkish is translated, singular person is a doctor. In English, that could be he is a doctor or she is a doctor. But 9 times out of 10, the translator is going to give he is a doctor. You give the sentence, a single person is a nurse, translate from Turkish into English, it will translate she is a nurse. So you can begin to see some of those biases there. Another interesting one, I know I'm chasing a rabbit, but this one I find absolutely fascinating. Emily Bender has talked about a program that was looking at how successfully, or it was looking at, now bother, I can't remember all of it, but it had to do with restaurant evaluations. And what it found was that so often the word Mexican, because of the discourse around immigration right now, had more negative connotations, that it was automatically scoring Mexican restaurants lower in quality for no other reason than it had some negative biases built in because of immigration discourse around the word Mexican. That's not one that I could demonstrate in class, but it is an interesting example that Emily Bender has talked about that you could pull out and show to a class, which I think would be interesting. And actually that sets us up, I think, very well for the second question cluster, which is who makes the rules for AI? A lot of my students will tell me they're not interested in policy, they're not interested in rules until they find out, for example, that in certain schools, students have been put on academic probation or expelled because a certain program said that their writing was AI generated. Then their ears perk up. If it can affect them, if it affects real people's lives, they might be interested. So one of the things that I think it is something you can do is to talk about policies and to recognize that none of our AI detection services are foolproof. I had a situation just this past week where I put a short piece of writing into 3 different AI detection services, and one said it was 100% definitely AI generated. The other said it was 100% definitely human generated. And so looking at those differences and then considering what counts as evidence, how do we know that we're reading AI generated text? Does it make a difference? Those policy discussions I think are important. And also related to that, getting students to just see that this has real impacts on real lives. One other example that I can point you to is this. I found this on Amazon this past week. It is an AI generated book. Kara Swisher published her memoir earlier this year. It is called Burn Book, I believe is the title. It's a legit text. Shortly after it was published, a series of shortened, this one here is only 70 pages in length, short AI generated knockoffs were posted on Amazon, and they're selling for about $10 each. By the time Amazon figures out that these are there and that they are fake and that they are pulling away from Kara Swisher's own memoir, whoever put this in, Taylor Brooks is apparently not a real well, there is a romance author named Taylor Brooks, but this is a problem for somebody's income, that AI is creating this fake book. I can show them that Amazon has a policy, but we can see how easy it is to bypass that policy, because I found, even after reading the story about the AI knockoffs on NPR, just this past week, I found the AI knockoff sitting there. So we could talk about that in the classroom and who that helps and hurts. People have talked about wanting watermarking for all AI generated content. So we could learn about what AI watermarking is, and do we think that is feasible? Is that something the government needs to do? Is there a difference between AI generated, AI assisted, AI reviewed? Learning about those policies. I think ultimately what I want to do this fall is give the students my current AI policy statement and then have them work on it. We might talk together about getting to see what ChatGPT would generate for an AI policy, but I definitely want them to think through what a policy would look like, how it would be enforced, what evidence could be used to support it, and to think about the consequences that might have for them in their own futures. So I'm going to stop there. I've had two clusters. What is AI is the first one. The second cluster, what policies and procedures are governing AI. And I'll stop there. Do we have any questions or comments about policies and procedures sort of at an institutional level?
We do have a policy question, so I'm going
Okay.
to address that one. When you begin talking about who sets AI policies, can you please tell us what current bills and acts are currently in legislation and who's proposing these bills? For example, I know some bills are proposed to make sure AI doesn't interfere with elections. These bills are most often proposed by politicians. What are working people saying about policies?
That's a really good question. And the truth of the answer is, I don't know. And that is worth finding out about. My suspicion is the vast majority of working folks don't know, and they're not saying much about it because it hasn't yet impacted them. But you will find people. So we saw it in the writer's strike in Hollywood for the strikes, the actors and writers strikes. That was a huge part of that. To look at what are the limits of AI generated content. Can that interfere with royalties, with revenues and things like that? Can certain scripting jobs be handed over to AI and have writers losing money that way? That, I think, when it becomes a part of their own job, then people begin to talk about it. I do not know off the top of my head what bills are in Congress, but I think that is certainly worth looking at. And I do suspect that they are generated by the politicians. Emily Bender, again, I use her a lot. There is a video of her testimony a couple of months ago before one of the House subcommittees on AI, and I think it's worth looking into that. Having students investigate those policy questions would be a terrific idea. What legislation is up in front of the Congress at any given point? I think that's a wonderful thing to have them looking into. Yeah.
Thank you, Miriam. That was the only question specifically about policy. We have a few others, but if you want to go on, we could leave those for the end.
Yeah, let's hold those to the end and then we'll come back to them.
Okay.
Yeah, 135. Yeah. The next cluster of questions, as we think about policy, I also want to think about personal use and getting students to think about the agency and authority they have to make personal decisions. Are there dangers? What can they do to protect themselves? And how do they make personal decisions about what they want to turn over to AI and when they want to do it? I heard a person recently, it was actually a keynote address here at my university, and the speaker said, AI is going to be great. We can hand over the monkey work in our jobs to AI. That was his term, monkey work. And my first thought was, yeah, but who decides that? Who picks what is monkey work and who isn't? Who's making that decision? And it is frightening to me to think that some of my students believe that perhaps things that I've assigned, that's monkey work. And then I have colleagues who believe that some of their grading is monkey work. And I can foresee a situation in which students are handing in machine generated content, what Emily Bender has called synthetic text, and machines are responding to it. And that's certainly not what I want my teaching to be. So I want to talk to my students about these decisions. How do we decide when we are going to hand off what we're doing to an AI, to a synthetic text generator? Her question was, when, if ever, is synthetic text safe, appropriate, and desirable? And her answer is almost basically never. Now, she's not saying that all AI is a problem, but when it comes to synthetic text of the ChatGPT sort, she doesn't see a lot of situations where it is safe, appropriate, and desirable. That answer may be too much for my students. I want them to think through, hey, when you sit down and you open ChatGPT or whatever the program is, what's in the user agreement? What are you agreeing to? And for me, this is the next question, and it's a big one. Is anyone going to believe that what's coming out of this was written by a human? And if someone is going to believe that, are you a willing participant in the deception? Is that okay with you to deceive someone into thinking that what you're giving them was written by a human? That to me is a huge question. I want them to think about who is benefiting and who is not benefiting when the task is handed over to an AI. Who makes that decision? Who is valuing? What's the value of the work? If the work is really valuable, is it so valuable that it cannot be entrusted to an AI? Why is the work valued? And that's, for me as an instructor, incredibly important to think about the value of the things that I am asking, because if my students don't understand the value, they may not have any motivation not to turn it over to an AI. So who values the work? Will this technology impact someone else's job? If I use this, will this impact someone else's job? What does that AI tech that is being used look like? Was it trained ethically? Was anyone harmed in that training process? And if something backfires, who is responsible for it? Is it me or is it someone else? So these are some questions that I want to help my students work through when they're making a decision. So the student who says to me, yeah, I use this to generate my cover letter for the job. I'm going to ask that question. Somebody's going to believe that that was generated by a human. Is that what you want? So then we come back to, well, I used it to generate a sample and then I tweaked the sample. That's a different situation. Then we look at walking through these questions. Is that an appropriate use? Why or why not? I want my students to think through these things. So I think, let me stop at this point. Are there questions about personal use that anybody wants to address before we hit the last area, which to me is one of the biggest?
I'm not sure if this is personal use, but it
Go ahead then.
to the larger picture of, can you talk about the choice of the word hallucination as it is related to AI? To me, that gives it an even more human quality. And I think you'd mentioned that at some point about the anthropomorphizing of AI, right?
Right. Oh, that's actually my next one. So that's a great
that's
setup
coming
to
up.
the
Okay,
next.
sneak preview.
Yeah, actually, I'm so glad you asked that, because to me, this is bottom line. I mean, my background is in applied linguistics, and so this is what I want to talk about most. I think the fourth area. So what is AI? Who is making policy at a large area that impacts me? But then how do I make my personal decisions? And then the fourth area, what are we doing with the language that we are using about AI? And I just want to throw out Emily Bender's Mystery AI Hype Theater. Every 2 or 3 weeks, she and her colleagues pick an article or a set of articles that talk about AI, and they break down the language used and the hype in those articles. This is not necessarily student friendly because it's fairly advanced, but for faculty, it's a fun hour-long listen. I assure you, it's a lot of fun. But for me, and it goes to the question that was just asked about hallucinations. When it comes to that language in AI, I want to spend a good bit of time with my students here. And the first area is on what are called mental process verbs. Verbs like hallucinate, intend, mean, understand, and know. These are verbs that are typically reserved for what is happening in a human brain. Hallucination is the standard word for the mistakes generated by AI, generative AI. I am like whoever asked that question. I don't like the word hallucination because it does suggest a human capability that I do not think the AI has. When we use these words, it is easy to slide into an assumption that we're dealing with a sensate being, and we aren't. We are dealing with a statistical algorithm that generates text based on probabilities. And so I find it highly problematic that we use these mental process verbs, and I would love for my students to explore that. Is it okay when we blur those boundaries? I don't think that it is necessarily, but those lines get blurred very, very quickly. Yeah, so that's the first area. The second area that I want to talk about my students with is the hype. Hype can come in two formats. One part of the hype is sort of the apocalyptic gloom and doom. The robots are going to take over the world. AI is going to be this huge problem in the future. That I find problematic because it shifts fears to an unknown future. And in the process of doing so, I think it often obscures the very real dangers, harms, and problems that are coming right now with AI. It obscures, for example, the environmental cost. It obscures the exploitative labor costs. It obscures those lines blurring human and machine even right now. It obscures the problems of protecting copyright. There are many things going on that using this apocalyptic hype makes problematic. So I want my students and I to talk about those things. I also want us to talk about hype of the sort of bandwagon approach, which I've seen a lot in education discourse. This is going to resolve the equity issues. It's going to level the playing field. It's going to do, well, quite frankly, probably not, because I don't know how long these technologies will be free. Eventually, they may be carrying a cost. And then even once again, those that have the ability to pay will be able to use them, and those that don't. But even beyond that, I think that this discussion that it's going to fix all these problems, and therefore you must get on the bandwagon now, that sets us up for problems, and it makes it difficult for those of us who are hesitant or reluctant to push back. So I want to talk about that type of ethos and pathos-based appeals that are inherent in a lot of the talk about AIs. And I think that's something we can do very productively with our students. I also want to point out to our students that AIs have been generally trained on Western variations of English, and there are Englishes spoken around the world that are perfectly fine Englishes, but they are not Western oriented, and they may be left out or in some ways discriminated against through the use of the technology. Not to mention the fact that it is Anglo-centric and there are thousands of languages in the world. Now, that doesn't mean that all AI is evil. Again, it's just thinking through the ways that we're using it. Large language models can be used to document and protect languages that are under threat. It can be done. There are many things that can be done. And the Linguistic Society of America has groups working, blending technology with language preservation and language revitalization. Not saying that, but in this particular realm, the generative AI, we are seeing that it doesn't allow a lot for anything but English, and Western Englishes in particular. So all to say, language has a lot of things that makes it amenable to these large language models. We do have collocations. Words occur together in very predictable, statistically relevant patterns. Understanding that and using things like concordancing software, that can really help us analyze and think about how genres work and what it means to sound like a member of a discipline because you are able to emulate and see the patterns of language use within that discipline. That's all great. But language is also very much meaning oriented, and I would say secondly, interactionally oriented, that every time I'm using language, I am negotiating a relationship with somebody else, and those things do not exist with machine generated text. Machine generated text is not intended. It doesn't have intent. It doesn't have purpose. And the meaning that I think I see in it is really there because I am a meaning generating person. I'm going to find meaning in it. But it is basically a statistical probability, not an intended meaning. And I want my students to see that difference. So there are things about language, I think, that make it amenable to large language models and some of the things they can do, but there's also things about language that should make us hesitant. if not outright resistant to some of the uses of large language models, GPT. I'm going to quickly mention these, and then let's just open the floor for questions, because this is going to wrap it up. Things that you would normally do in a class, do it here. Conduct headline hunts, practice revising things, eliminating hype, conduct image and text analyses. We know a lot of these. Doing things that allow us to explore different modes of writing and reading and literacy. And I'm just going to throw out there that not everything has to be digital. My daughter has a beautiful course idea where they handle some of the discussion topics related to semiotics and meaning, but they do it through tactile things like fabrics. There are other ways of creating meaning that are not digital only. And so allowing broadening our understanding beyond the text, beyond the digital, I think is important. Discourse communities, getting students to follow diverse scholars, to hear other voices, using software, but also thinking about the ramifications of the software that we use. I will just throw this out quickly again. I heard this weekend a conversation, and it was fascinating to think people were talking about how AIs and would enable this this great accessibility. Think about that carefully, because especially with voice activated AIs, this creates an incredible difficulty for people whose first languages are not English, who speak a non-Western English, or for English speakers who have a stuttering issue. And the AIs are trained to detect a silence as time to speak. And these folks, when they have voice generated AI or voice activated AI, they can't interact with it. It cuts them off. So those are all the kinds of issues that I think I want to explore with my students. I haven't finished the syllabus yet, like I said, but here I think is the bottom line. Focusing on AI as a matter of critical literacy can help us raise tough questions and invite students as well as ourselves to begin to make decisions with our eyes a little bit open, if not wide open. So I'm going to stop there, Vivian, and let's just see what other questions have come up, because I know we don't have tons of time.
Sure. So I'll just get right into it. The first question was, I'd love to see 2 to 3 accessible articles or videos like AI for Dummies. So I didn't know if your slideshow presentation may have already had something like that, or if you have something you could point this instruction to.
There are some things in there, links, but what I'm going to suggest is the video, the first video that I have linked by Emily Bender. It's under the slide that says video resources, and I have one that she has a very basic, here is what AI does. Here's how it works. And she explains it from a computational linguist point of view. And she takes it step by step through. And to me, that is the best explanation. It's video driven. The video itself is about an hour long, but that part of it is only about 10 minutes. And I think that is probably the best explanation that I have seen, that is both technically accurate and accessible.
Excellent. Thank you, Miriam.
Yep.
Next question is about blaming AI for copying a book seems tantamount to blaming VCRs for movie piracy. Shouldn't we be treating the disease like lack of pride of authorship, disrespect for art, rather than the symptoms?
Oh, it's a very good question. I mean, it's certainly yes, but ultimately, I'm not sure how to answer that one fully. I would like to see protections, because if someone somewhere is going to be paid to type a text into an AI, and that person, I mean, yes, there are many, many broader issues at work here. Exploitative labor is only one of them. I guess there's not a simple answer. I'm not blaming the AI, but I do blame the corporations and the business models that they're working under. At least at this point, it seems to me that they are the most likely to be responsible. And they can set policies and they can make changes to their business model that would disincentivize things like feeding full texts into an AI, but I don't think they've done that yet. But is there a simple solution? No. And should the AI itself be blamed? Probably not. I am a skeptic, but I am not going to say that everything is the fault of the AI, nor do I think that the technology is evil in any sense. I think we need to look at it carefully. And there needs to be solutions from a broad sector, not only from the businesses themselves, but also academics. I think public intellectuals, I think cognitive scientists can do a great deal of this, as well as publishers and others who are in the business of protecting copyright in the works of authors.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Next question about policy. My university has made Copilot available. We also have Office 365. How are these decisions being made?
I would love to know. That is a really good question. I don't know who is making, because I suspect that every university is slightly different in what they're allowing. So I had a colleague I met recently who told me her university is not allowing access to things like ChatGPT on campus. So they're cutting it off. Others are partnering with ChatGPT. So I think this is something institutionally and system-wide. I'm part of a university system. There are institution level decisions, there are university system level decisions in the university system of Georgia. But I think talking to your faculty senate, your administration about how those decisions are made, because I don't know that there is a single model in any given institution for how these are made. For example, at my school, there's no central guidance right now. We are allowed to put whatever policy we want. We just told, make it clear and put it in the syllabus. Well, I have to tell you, that is difficult because for some faculty, Grammarly is an AI. For other faculty, it's not. They want students to use Grammarly. So it's a morass in a lot of ways, and helping students to ask the questions, I think, is a great starting point, because I don't know that there is a single model governing any of the implementation.
Okay, great. And that covered another question because someone said, how are you doing at your institute? Next question. Do you know of any custom AI modules created for specific university level courses that are closed? And by closed, saying that it only pulls data provided by the department, can't release any data outside. So it's kind of an AI function that's not pulling from everywhere. It's in a closed space, right?
No, I don't. I don't know of any, but I would be interested in finding out. Yeah, if someone knows of those, I don't know about them. That sounds like a fascinating idea. I don't know.
Okay, next question. Doesn't AI boil down to getting others to do our thinking for us? Why do we need AI? I understand it's used for medical diagnoses, healing, etc., but it has so many negative aspects. Why use it at all in classrooms for writing assignments?
That's a really good question. I'm not an expert. So first of all, I'll say that I am not an expert. I am learning like everybody else is. I am inclined to be in agreement with this person. I don't want my students using it. And my hope is that in having the conversations that we have built around these questions, that they will come to see along with me that this is not, at least for their writing, that this is not an acceptable use. It does not make sense. And again, I'm quoting Emily Bender here, but she says, you look at the use design of a technology. And the concern with AI is that it is not targeting a very specific thing, unlike a spell check, which did, or something that is targeted to read mammogram results, for example. That has very targeted a specific outcome. This doesn't, and that makes it scary. And I do think that for many of my students, they think it's just a little help. But what I am seeing is that we are losing a thinking process. Great example of that is the students who are telling me, I don't have time to read a scholarly article, but GPT will give me a summary. And I want to say to them, but this is what we do if you're going into academics. You've got to read the scholarly article. You need to do that work. Part of my job, I think, is to convince them of that, to help them see that. And if they can make that decision for themselves, I want to do this work and not hand it over to GPT, then I think I've done my job better. if that makes any sense.
Miriam. And can you speak to how important it will be for K through 12 education to introduce and incorporate AI in their curriculum? I fear this will be the real equity issue. Students of underserved schools and groups will be left behind.
That is a terrific question. And part of me is wanting to say, this is where I don't want to see AI. I don't want to have my students so used to it by the time I get them in the university that they're already using it. But I think, yes, AI literacy has to begin before the first year in college. Otherwise, we are setting ourselves up for incredibly difficult days in college. So I would leave it at that I think K-12 instructors, we have talked to some in our area who've actually gone back to timed writing, in-class writing, things like that, to avoid the AI issue. There are issues with that as well, because then you remove a lot of your writing process. I mean, there's a lot of, it's a complicated question. There is no easy answer, but 100%, I think AI literacy needs to factor in to K-12 education. We just can't wait for them to get to college.
We have a question related to who makes the rules. What do you suggest as best practices for developing policies at university level? And lots of grassroots discussions, activities are institution, but many think there should be more deliberate, organized efforts.
I am with you on that. In fact, I am working with my institution because we have so little right now. We are trying to develop some guidelines for this. But as far as the best practices, and this is a frustration that I have, sorry, personal rant here with the term best practice. It's hard for me when something has existed for a year and a half to say that we can have best practices. I don't know that we have best practices yet. It may be too early for best practices. But I do think the Rutgers document that I shared with you all, or that will be shared, it's one of the first slides, has one of the best approaches, because it sort of gives 3 outlines. Faculty who want to embrace AI for a variety of reasons, and it gives examples for non-writing classes where AI might be very much a part of what they want to do, limited use and no use. And it offers policy language for all 3 of those variations. And I think that approach, where the administration says, we're going to really embrace faculty autonomy on this, but we are going to give you some guidelines. If you do allow it, these are the things you need to specify. If you are allowing it only in certain circumstances, here's what you've got to specify. And if you're not allowing it, here is also what you need to do to make that policy work in your classroom. Having a document from your teaching and learning center, from your deans, something like that, that allows for faculty autonomy, but then lays out some language that people can use, I think that would be ideal.
Are you more leaning toward or away from asking for AI essays in your comp courses? Huge topic at this person's school.
Yes, I am very much leaning away from it. I don't want that. And I would be the one to assign an essay about AI and try to get students to write about AI generated text in ways that I think would be very difficult for the AI itself to do. I would be including things like interviewing people on campus. I would be doing things, watching videos. I am leaning away. I don't want my students to use AI in their writing processes in my first year writing classes at all. But I'm trying to address it by talking so much about it that they are going to be doing other things, if that makes any sense. But yes, I am leaning against it. I don't want them to use it. But I am also not going, if they've used it to come up with an outline, I do have my policy right now is that I would like you to ask permission. I would like you to discuss with me ahead of time how you plan to use it. And then if we do decide that you're going to use it for some part of your paper, we will work together to figure out how to document it. So that's my current policy, that they have to do those things. They need to ask me, we have a discussion, and if they do use it in some way, it has to be documented. And then this fall, one of the things I plan to do is have my students revise that policy with me.
I've heard of that before. This seems a little bit like a counterpoint. Most students will encounter AI tools in a workspace and will not be going into academia. How do you balance academic rigor with preparation for their realistic future?
That's a great one. And in some ways, I avoid the question. And that seriously though, what I have done before is I will have students go and do interviews with people in their area to talk about how they use AI, for example, to bring samples of how it is used, to talk about the training. So I would have them do a research project about how AI works in that field. But then in my classroom, when they write that up, we're not going to use it. And we're going to handle that in a different way. For one thing, though, I want them to get on the ground real input, because I'm hearing, oh, it's going to be used in industry, but then I want them to actually talk to people to see what that looks like. Is it what they think it means? That's definitely, because I have heard, for example, a guy that I know who uses AI to do some quarterly reports and things like that. That's spitting out some charts and things in it. It's a very targeted type of AI. I would want my students to look and see that's not ChatGPT. That's a different monster. Can we figure that out? And that's how I would try to approach that balance. Again, in some ways, it's avoiding the question up front. I tell them I cannot teach them to write, but I can help them research their field.
And Miriam, are you okay on time? Because we have a few more questions.
I have nowhere else to go for the next
Okay,
20 minutes.
great.
Oh yeah, we're good. I'm glad to go over a bit.
So this one, you mentioned sentience. What are your thoughts on Lambda? That's all caps. And Blake Lemoine. Lambda was shut down by Google and Blake Lemoine fired because he said Lambda became sentient, right?
Yeah. I don't know all the details on that story. So I can't really speak to it. I will say this, and there are people who have said that sentience is itself a construct that is built out of statistical probabilities, and that there is no difference between human sentience and machine probabilities. I disagree with that. I can't prove it, and I'm not going to try to. I just am going to say that I believe human cognition and self-awareness, intent, is a real thing that is different from an algorithm. And I am, well, again, I quote Emily Bender a lot, but I'm going to quote her again. She has said that she will not engage in a discussion with anyone who does not recognize her status as human and not a machine at the outset. Because a lot of people say, how do you know that we're not all stochastic parrots and we're not all just machines and whatever? And she just says, that one I'm not going to go with. And so I'm going to kind of echo her and say, I'm not going to go there. I don't know about the Lambda situation enough to speak to it. But yeah, I do think that there is a difference between a machine that is algorithm driven, no matter how complicated, and a human being.
Miriam, you brought to mind a screenwriter who said machines don't have childhood trauma and experiences to be able to draw from when
That's
they're
right.
writing something. So I completely agree with you
Yep.
there. Next question is one solution colleges and universities seem to be exploring is enterprise options. So like contracts with specific Gen AI vendors, as you mentioned earlier. So input and material can be contained and not circulated beyond the university. What are your thoughts about such an approach? And what suggestions do you have for university level policies regarding Gen AI?
Yeah. Okay, so one thing that I think that addresses, well, first of all, let me step back. I don't know a whole lot about those. I have read a little bit about those partnerships. I'm not fully aware of them. And again, I'm not an AI expert. I'm a writing teacher trying to figure it all out. What I like about those is that it does offer some protections for students so that whatever they are submitting into the AI for, like, for example, if we wanted in my classroom to give a piece of writing to an AI and to see what suggestions it made versus our suggestions for proofreading that paper or for revising that paper, I see that as a legitimate exercise because it allows us to talk about the revising process. Those types of partnerships protect the student work in ways that respect FERPA, and they also respect just the value of student work in general, which I think is important. If we think the students need to write these papers, we need to have respect for that as their intellectual work. So those partnerships are good in that way. My second concern, though, is, so that's the good part. The parts that I still am concerned about, and this goes back to what is the use that we intend this for? Are we giving over some level of thinking to the AI? Is there something that the AI is going to do that replaces a learning objective for our students? Then I would have a problem with it. And then the other piece of that is just in terms of corporations and the business model. Does that mean that if it is closed and in-house, that students are going to have to pay for it? Will it be added onto their fees? What does that fee structure look like? And yeah, so that's a second concern. But I think the bottom line concern, while I think that is helpful for privacy, I still want to know, what is the end use? What's the purpose? And do we see, is that the purpose that we're just getting on the bandwagon? Or is there a legitimate pedagogical purpose in terms of writing that we are accomplishing? Then I would see some value, but I'd want to see those. My university, to my knowledge, is not engaged in any such partnership right now, so it's really hard for me to know.
Thank you so much, Miriam. This is more like a comment, but also it seems like those with backgrounds in computer science have an advantage in understanding AI, leaving out English majors. So
Yeah.
that's more like a comment. And
Agreed.
then
Agreed.
let's see. My doctoral students search job openings for academic jobs, and several job descriptions desire knowledge of and ability to use AI. Same for undergraduate students preparing to graduate. So like there's another comment there in terms of that job readiness of having to have some kind of AI preparedness. Okay, so
that goes back to, I would really love, and we can do this as a part of a freshman paper. What does that look like? Do they just mean that you can ask good prompts? And then there's part of me thinking too, I don't want to see AI become our replacement for search engines, because search engines do a very good job at what they do. And AI is not a search engine. So again, I'm just, what is it that they want? What does the job want from the AI? And also, again, AI is huge. It can be many, many different things. So I would want to understand more about that. But definitely, I think it's something that we can pursue in our writing classes, is working with students to research it. Absolutely.
Yeah, you're right. It is a big umbrella term. So what are they getting at?
Yeah.
Next question. Would you consider students, specifically ESL students who use translators to help them with writing assignments, classify as using AI? Is this similar to the idea of Grammarly being considered AI? I've had this occur multiple times this semester, and I find that they have the same signs of using diction that they do not know or understand and cannot explain to me when I ask them what it means.
Okay, we need another webinar for that question, Vivian. And whoever asked it, thank you for asking this question. This is critical to me. And it is I don't outlaw translators in my classrooms. But I think we have to be very wary and very careful. And this is, as much as anything, helping students to know the limitations and development. So a couple of years ago, I had a young man who was a lovely writer, who was very scared of his English abilities. And he would always start by writing his full paper in Spanish, run it through Google Translate, and then he would do about 5 layers of revision in English. And I didn't have a problem with it because I knew what he was doing. He told me about it, and we did the revising together. It also led to the best conversations about English language and why certain things didn't work, and you wouldn't want to use that phrase. But we had time to do that. And so it was a platform for learning that I thought was lovely. It doesn't always work that way. And I think students need to know that. Ideally, students would be confident enough in their English that when we send them out to discipline-based classes, that they wouldn't need to rely on a translator. But it definitely happens. My typical response is that if it is a sentence or a phrase, no, I don't consider it cheating and I don't consider it AI use. I consider it strategic translanguaging, using all their language resources. But I definitely think that is something that those of us who work with multilingual writers, we need to be on top of that, helping them with knowing the limits. And when they get into a class and they're saying, oh my goodness, I feel more and more like I need to run this through a translator, that's where we need to say, wow, where are our tutors? Where are our support services? Where are our people who can walk through this with you so that you are not going to get charged with cheating? And that is, but the reason I said, Viv, we need another webinar on this, multilingual students are caught in this crossfire. They are caught more often on AI flags. They are caught more often on this stuff, and they need our support, not our penalties. So, yeah.
So a couple of comments. I also use that technique. My students can use AI as a resource, but must always cite it and provide their prompt. And then the other comment, which should be interest to you, the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, so state level, is putting together a study of how AI is being used in the professions. I would predict that they will find very limited use of Gen AI, such as ChatGPT, and so the marketing push for us to use it in classes won't hold water. Thank you. This has been fantastic. And I did want to say, I've had a few instructors say this is the best webinar they've attended. They've really enjoyed your webinar. So I want to share that with you because I've been typing the thank yous to those, but to let you know, a few more thank yous for excellent presentations.
Thank you. And I just
Yeah,
want
best discussion on AI that I have heard. So we've had a few of those. So Miriam, that's
okay,
it for questions, by the way.
I appreciate that. And just before we sign off, I want to reiterate, I am a learner and a thinker on this. And I told my husband, yeah, it's some other folks that I was doing this webinar, and then I thought, and I still don't know why, because I am not an expert. I really am not. And I have made mistakes on this. I'm learning. I am so learning. And I look forward to learning from maybe some feedback and the interaction from the discussion. You all have already given me some ideas, things I need to pursue. So I appreciate it. So glad for the opportunity.